Good evening, everyone. I am Sean Beckner Carmitchel with District 34. I am on a Zoom call with Rebecca Brown, who is a legal fellow with Courtwatch Los Angeles. Rebecca, how are you?
Hi, Sean. I'm doing well. Stayed busy over here. How you doing?
I'm fantastic. It's also been busy for alternative news. Um, could you talk a little bit about what Courtwatch Los Angeles is?
So Courtwatch Los Angeles is a volunteer-driven organization that focuses on furthering transparency in the misdemeanor courts in Los Angeles. When we're not in pandemic times, what we're primarily doing is training volunteers to go into misdemeanor courtrooms across the LA Superior Court system to basically observe what's going on because misdemeanor courtrooms are kind of a mystery in LA and across the country. The judges have a ton of discretion, the prosecutors have a ton of discretion, and this is where we see our most vulnerable neighbors being criminalized. So people of color, low income people, unhoused people are all being criminalized through this system, and that comes into play with all of the discretion that the judges and other folks in the system have. So normally we're in watching for troubling issues going on, such as racism, bias, bail setting practices. But since the pandemic's been happening, it's not really safe to send our volunteers into court, and we've kind of shifted our model. So now we're pretty much operating off of tips from people who've been in court. So that includes attorneys, people who are there for their own cases, family members, even court employees have been reaching out to us. We're just kind of playing everything by ear right now, but we've just kind of turned into focusing on reporting on the really unsafe practices that are going on in the courts right now with COVID.
Got it. So just to backtrack a little bit, you mentioned that in misdemeanor courts, the judges and prosecutors have a lot of discretion. Could you go into that a little bit for a layman, what that discretion is?
Right. It starts with what charges are filed for someone. After they're arrested, first the prosecuting agency, whether it's the city attorney's office, the district attorney's office. There's also some smaller cities have their own prosecutors, like Santa Monica, Long Beach, like that. They're deciding, after someone's arrested, do we want to press charges against this person, and what are these charges going to be? Some they could opt and say, this isn't that serious of a situation. We don't need to file any charges right now. Or they could say, let's look and see how many different possible charges could apply to the situation and rack them up and get the maximum for whatever reason they might want to do that. And then it continues in the courtroom in terms of, your next step is really going to be bail setting. Is the person going to be incarcerated while they're waiting for their case to go to trial? Or are they going to be released and, be able to be back home with their family and their community and be trusted to come back into court? And so that, again, is an area where the prosecutors are requesting, and then the judges have their discretion. Of course, they are independent from the prosecutors and the defenders, to go with what the prosecutor suggests, even increase the bail beyond that. And then there's just kind of a lot of smaller steps in between with different kind of more technical things that I won't go into further detail on. But we're really seeing, if someone's case is brought with one prosecuting agency and one judge, it can be dismissed or they can face a small fine or something. But if it just so happens that their case ends up with a different prosecutor and a different judge, they can face an extensive jail sentence essentially for the same offense.
Got it. And you mentioned that the district attorney's office is elected. Judges are city judges that are dealing with misdemeanor courts. Are they elected or appointed?
They're elected generally every 2 years. If there is a vacancy that comes up, they'll be appointed. But definitely plug 2022. No one pays attention to judicial elections. No one knows the names on the ballot. We got to change that.
Absolutely. So you have the prosecutors who are appointed by the district attorney who's elected, but the prosecutors themselves are not elected.
And then there actually are some city attorney elections as well. So a lot to look forward to, and a lot of ways that the community can kind of have some input here.
So 2022 it sounds like a really big year for judicial elections. It's interesting. I wasn't going to go down this road, but I am curious. Where can people go to find out judges' beliefs, how they're going to go through the judicial process while they're running. Because I think that maybe one of the issues is it can be really difficult to find information on judicial candidates.
Yeah, that's absolutely 100% true. I mean, myself, I'm always like Googling, progressive voter guide for the judges. It's really hard to find this information, but we actually do have an exciting project in the works that's being led by this really great organization called La Defensa that we're going to be supporting to build out a website where we're basically the public can submit. Basically reviews and ratings on judges. And then we'll build out little biographies about the judges. So that will kind of be an area where all this information is contained together. So that's kind of in the works now and will hopefully be up in a couple of months. So I'm hoping, by the time 2022 rolls around, we'll have a lot of great information in there and that can be a resource for folks to get information.
I'm looking forward to talking to you when that's up.
Yes.
That sounds like a really useful tool. So let's backtrack a little bit for the real reason that I think we're talking. Courts are open.
Yes.
Misdemeanor courts are open. Are traffic courts open?
So kind of the rundown is courts are open. In terms of the criminal courts are open, but jury trials are not happening right now. So we're having arraignments are happening, other hearings are happening, some are being delayed. Traffic court, however, is open full steam ahead. And some of the hearings can be conducted over the phone or online, but traffic trials, which are for traffic tickets,
Mhm.
which is below misdemeanors, have to happen in person and are continuing to happen in person now, which in my opinion is unconscionable.
Yeah, that's I think 58 people died in Los Angeles County yesterday of COVID. Um, so we're in the middle of a pandemic. Los Angeles is currently not just one of the cities and counties hit hardest in California, but it's one of the biggest hotspots in the United States. And not only that, but it's actually one of the biggest hotspots in the world. Would you argue that there's systems we could put in place to prevent any contact for trials at all right now, or for court at all right
I
now?
mean, I think, it's a complicated question, but I think there's absolutely steps that can be taken. I think the first thing, kind of the biggest, I think most obvious thing, is that we need to reevaluate what proceedings are essential. Traffic court does not need to be happening. Someone does not need to be coming into court over a ticket they got a few months ago. Just like shut that all down. Um, Unlawful detainer trials are happening for evictions. Those do not need to be happening right now. We should absolutely not be evicting people when the pandemic is worse than it's ever been and only going to get worse from here. So I think we need to reprioritize what's happening, but I do also believe that people who are in custody, incarcerated right now, in pretrial detention, do need to have their day in court. So what I think is that we need to reprioritize what's happening in our court buildings to try to minimize the number of people who have to be in there.
Mhm.
And then from that, once folks do have to be in the court buildings, we need safety precautions and guidelines to actually be followed. They do have the rules kind of on the books that, you need to be wearing a mask, you need to be 6 feet apart. That's, it's not really enforced and it's not really happening. And in fact, some of the biggest perpetrators of not wearing masks are law enforcement, are the LASD deputies. We've been hearing time and time again not wearing masks in the courthouses. So, if we're eliminating a large chunk of these trials that don't need to be happening, those folks won't be in the court. And then, also giving more leeway for jurors. If we're going to be having trials for people who are incarcerated, which I do think need to happen and should be happening in person for due process. We've had jurors who have very severe health conditions contact us, and they're being forced to go into court. So we shouldn't be forcing anyone to go in, but I do think it is a balancing act of people have been incarcerated for months who've not even been convicted of a crime, and so we need to help those people out as well.
So you're saying that there's people that are just sort of in this legal limbo. They're not able to actually be, assuming that, I'm sure that there's someone out there who has not committed the crime they're charged with. So you're saying that there's a significant amount of people who are just sort of in that legal limbo. They're just waiting for the jury trial to
Yep.
happen.
So right now in Los Angeles County, our jail population is above 15,000, which is approaching pre-pandemic levels. And I think it's about over 8,000 of those people are in pretrial detention. So that's over half of the people who are in our county jails right now have not been convicted of a crime and are simply waiting to have their trial. And, as we know, this is going to be people who can't afford bail. This is, uh, you know, it's just two different systems of justice for those who can afford to pay bail, who can be out home, taking safety precautions, sheltering in place, and those who don't have financial resources who are in our jails, which are COVID hotbeds and are extremely unsafe right now. And so since our trials have been delayed, hasn't really there just haven't been any criminal trials happening. There was a small window for like 2 or 3 weeks where there were a few, but over the summer months, there were no trials happening for people who were incarcerated. So, people do have a constitutional right under the federal and California constitutions to a speedy trial. That's being delayed and delayed and delayed. So people have been waiting since March to get a trial date.
So what happens eventually? I'm assuming we're talking, it's late December. What happens when the spread slows down? Is there going to be a backlog? Or are these people going to be waiting even longer because there are so many people waiting to
Yeah.
try?
Um, there already is a huge backlog, and the public defenders have been getting extremely overwhelmed. I think right now there's like 7,000 outstanding cases in their backlog. So again, I think that's coming down to prioritizing to, well, first of all, releasing people from jail, from pretrial detention, and prioritizing what trials need to go forward first, which would be for those who are in custody. And also, I think that the district attorney's office, the city attorney's office, and other prosecuting agencies need to look at, what cases are they bringing for low level offenses? When we have such a backlog of cases, do we need to be, bringing this case for, loitering or something like that, or even, sleeping on the sidewalk? Do we need to be bringing a case for someone for being unhoused? I don't think so.
So let's talk a little bit about the conditions in these courts. I think I've looked at your Twitter page, or the Twitter page, excuse me, for Courtwatch
Mhm.
Los Angeles, um, and what I'm seeing is a lot of pictures of a lot of people during a pandemic where we're approaching someone dying every few hours in Los Angeles. We're approaching this place where spread is just absolutely completely out of control. And I'm seeing on your Twitter page hallways that are indoors just absolutely filled with people. Oftentimes there's at least one person without a mask. What can we do to stop this?
I mean, this is again coming down to why are we bringing these people into court in the first place? The court, I guess it was in November, did issue an order saying that people who are not parties to a case or attorneys, essentially members of the public, can't come into court. That's kind of seemed to have a minimal impact because we're still bringing so many people into the courthouses every day. Again, mask adherence is not 100%. It's generally, impossible to stay 6 feet apart as much as people are trying with that many people in a space. You can't. Also when you're having defendants or other parties to cases who need to talk to their lawyers, you can't have a private conversation with your attorney 6 feet apart.
Mhm.
Another issue we're seeing is the lockups, which are the kind of cells, small rooms that they're holding folks who are incarcerated, and they're bringing them into their court date. They're putting them in these lockups. We're hearing, first we got reports of certain court, I think Santa Clara was like 20 people in a lockup. And then we're hearing from Pomona, they're having 50, 40 people in a lockup. And other courthouses have reported similar numbers within a day. So you're putting people in these small rooms together, they can be coming from different jails into these small rooms together. it's extremely unsafe. Back in September, the Department of Health conducted some audits, I think, of 5 different courthouses, and specifically commented on the poor ventilation in the lockups, interview rooms, that there's not, enough hand sanitizer available. People are not adhering to the safety guidelines. So again, it starts with, let's re-examine how many people are coming into the courthouses in the first place, and let's, actually take the CDC guidelines as seriously as possible.
Are we seeing? I know the deck. Excuse me. We have a new district attorney, George Gascon. I know that he is stating that he's going to do away with cash bail. Uh, do we find that when we release people, we let them know when their court day is? Do we find that they show up
Yeah,
most of the time?
overwhelmingly, that people are returning to court. There was a great study with the Bail Project in Compton, where there's it's still cash bails happening, but they're funding people's cash bail, so it's not coming out of pocket. Where out of everyone they funded, overwhelmingly everyone returned to court for their hearings. In addition, when there are easy systems we can put in place, like effective reminders for people of when their court dates are, transportation assistance to get to court. It's impossible to park downtown if you even have a car in the first place. And then, additional support from local community organizations can help people, get childcare, make up for missed work, things like that, to get people into court. So I think, saying that we're going to have these criminals running free and escaping the system is just this like old fear mongering tactic that's been used forever. And it's really not the case.
So for someone who hasn't been through the court process, I'm sure you have as a legal fellow. Lord knows I've had to do this. You mentioned effective reminders. What's the process like of going to your court date? Is that something that you think could be improved?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, like I mentioned before, when you're arrested, that doesn't automatically mean that charges are going to be brought against you and you're going to have a criminal case. It can be really difficult to find out if charges are being brought against you. Um, so you can search online, but the truth is that the prosecuting agencies basically have up until the day of your court hearing to file the charges. So starting with that, people are having to go into court just to hear that their cases are dismissed, which is great, that or not even dismissed, that they're not being brought in the first place. So it's great that charges are not being filed against folks, but they could be notified, a week in advance, even 48 hours, 24 hours in advance, that they don't need to show up to court, especially in the pandemic. Um, and so that's kind of the first step of the confusion. And then, from there, when you're in court, your public defender can work with you, and they'll let you know when your next court date is, and the judge will announce it. But simple systems of, text reminders or email reminders, or being able to check more easily online, or know where to check online, could go a long way.
Absolutely. So what you're saying is there's people coming into the courtroom during the pandemic who don't have any charges filed against them?
Yes,
Okay.
because
Um,
if you even if you think that if you're unsure, we'd still advise you to go into court, because if you for some reason think that charges aren't going to be filed against you, maybe your case falls under some of the new charges from the district attorney's office, but they're exceptions, and then you decide to not go into court, they can issue a bench warrant for your arrest, which just opens up a number of other issues. So the better option is to go in, unfortunately.
got it. Are there any accommodations made for someone who perhaps is high risk or perhaps does test positive for COVID?
Um, Not really. I mean, it kind of, it depends on the circumstance. And again, this comes into the judge's discretion a lot of, um, if you could have an attorney go in and appear on your behalf. But, for example, I'm not sure if you saw on our social media recently, but we were contacted by someone about a week ago, a week and a half ago, who had a traffic court trial set in Beverly Hills, and he'd already continued his case once, and he was sick with COVID, and he had a positive test and had symptoms, And so he called the court clerk before to say the day before his trial date to say, what can I do? Can I continue my case because I have COVID? And continue means come in later. Continue is postpone. It's confusing. Um, and the court clerk said no, he couldn't continue the case because he'd already come in. He couldn't appear by phone for the trial, which is again for a traffic ticket. Um, and so he's asked, it sounds like my only option is to come in and into court when I have COVID, which is irresponsible. And she said, well, we've actually issued arrest warrants for people who've come into the courthouse with COVID. And so he said, what am I supposed to do? And she said, well, if you don't come, you will likely get a failure to appear, which then has its own consequences, including fines. You can get points on your license, things like that. And so he basically was left that his only option was to, not come into court and accept a failure to appear on his record because he had COVID and he was trying to be a good person and not go into court when he was very sick.
So this is someone who's essentially receiving a traffic ticket. This is not someone who really physically would need to be there as far as safety concerns or anything like that.
So yeah, he had already gotten the traffic ticket, and this was the trial to, if he wanted to plead or contest it.
Got it. Let's talk a little bit. I know that you sort of have your eyes on the ground in the court system right now. One pretty big sea change is the election of new district attorney George Gascon. There's been a lot of controversy with his election. I think you can probably agree with that. With the removal of cash bail, as well as with new directives towards prosecutors. Have you noticed that there's a change in this sort of feeling that you're seeing from prosecutors that are working under him?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to paint everyone with a broad brush and say all the deputy district attorneys are not following it. There's, tons of the deputy district attorneys are, taking it in stride and following the policies, and we absolutely commend them for that. But unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of pushback. And again, this is really going back to the fear mongering tactics that I mentioned before. We're seeing the same language, the same narratives that were used in the 80s and 90s to fuel mass incarceration to what it is today. Of these stories of all the murderers are going to be running free and kidnapping your children and destroying Los Angeles County, and that's really, I mean, of course, not at all the case. And if you actually take time to read through the directives, and they all come with introductions and explaining the scientific evidence of that they're based off of, that's not the case. But we are seeing right off the bat, we're seeing deputy district attorneys who are filing the motions to dismiss certain allegations or enhancements, and then saying on the record, Your Honor, you don't have to, in the interest of justice, you're free to deny my motion, and there's not enough evidence to support my motion. Which is pretty nuts to see lawyers, filing one thing and then arguing against it. Or refusing to follow them at all. And we're also unfortunately seeing the same thing on the judge side. And of course the judges are not bound by the district attorney's directives, but you're having a deputy district attorney arguing for no bail and the public defender also arguing for no bail, and then the judge deciding to impose bail for other reasons.
Got it. So basically, for a layman, what we're seeing, what you're saying is you have uh, the district attorney who's an elected official instituting what essentially is the reform that his ticket was based on in order to get elected. He's in charge of the district attorney's office. The people that are working under him are basically not following these directives in some cases.
Yeah,
Would that be accurate?
yeah, that's an accurate statement. And we're seeing it go beyond that to stories being shared with the press, even kind of the case details being shared with the press that should likely otherwise be confidential. Some folks are even organizing a recall effort, and that we've seen deputy district attorneys involved with that. So it's pretty concerning. I mean, this is what I think was like 2 million folks in Los Angeles County wanted to see. And especially at this time when as we said, there's such a backlog in cases. it's so dangerous to be bringing people into the courtrooms. I would, like to think that the prosecutors are looking towards dismissing cases that are, low level, not serious offenses, to clear out the backlog for themselves and make it a safer work environment for themselves.
All right. So I guess I know that you're running a little bit low on time, so we'll ask the big questions. Is there I guess the one big thing is what can we do to help Court Watch?
Sure. Well, if you happen to find yourself in court, and I hope that you don't for any reason, please feel free to report back to us on what you're seeing. And, I do think one of the kind of troubling things that we're seeing is that there's people keep asking us for action steps and what can we do? And we're kind of just yelling into a void. Um, People, the Public Defenders Union, a housing attorney coalition have tried to talk to the presiding judge, Kevin Brazil, to just no avail. We've reached out to the Board of Supervisors over the last few months. And so, it's kind of like there's no one to kind of talk to. So I think that really just increasing the public awareness of what's going on is ultimately kind of our best strategy for putting pressure on the courts. So just, sharing this information, people don't, this is kind of a corner of our local government that people don't necessarily know about if they're not directly involved in it. And it's really important, I think. So just sharing the message and sharing these pictures and the stories that we're hearing, I think is going a long way.
And people can find Court Watch's pictures and things like that on Twitter at Court Watch, correct?
Yes, so we're at Courtwatch LA on Twitter and on Instagram. And then you can also feel free to shoot us an email, courtwatchlosangeles@gmail.com.
I highly recommend the Twitter page. It's actually been really useful for me just to kind of understand an element of, I think, the city and the county that you don't really see until you're unfortunately part of it.
Yeah,
And it's been, I can't tell you how many of those pictures you look at, but there's no reason that this has to exist. So
absolutely.
Court Watch as an organization, so would it be fair to say that you're asking for a moratorium on any eviction related court cases? You're asking for a program where people who are not being convicted of violent offenses and who aren't looking for jail time could conceivably call in or use Zoom, and you're asking for uh, safer measures in the court. Would that be a good
Yeah,
summary?
yeah, I think so. Pretty much. I think moratorium on eviction and traffic trials for sure. We do think that any criminal trials would be best happening in person, but I think that we do need to be having trials for folks who are in custody, but I don't think these, low level, non-violent, not serious cases really need to be happening in the first place. And we also think that, folks should not be held in custody when they haven't even been convicted of a crime at all, and especially during the midst of the pandemic. And then, like you said, once we do get into the court buildings, we need, safety procedures to be put in place. And I did forget to mention, but I do want to mention, speaking of the court buildings, is that there's no screening happening at the doors when people are coming in. No
Right.
temperature checks, no
Or
questions happening. No, they have been checking to see if you're a necessary party, so you're not just a general member of the public. But you could walk right in there with COVID-19, and it's been happening, and they're not checking for that at all.
all right. Is there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, I mean, we're just really disappointed in the Superior Court's response to this. It's just incredibly unsafe for folks who are in custody, for the attorneys that are working in the buildings, for the court staff that are working in the buildings. And we really need to see some changes.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Please stay safe.
Thank you. You as
Safe.
well.